June 6, 1944. 5:58 hours. A pale gray light settles over the western edge of Normandy. The tide is turning. Cold water withdraws from the sand, exposing rows of German obstacles, steel hedgehogs, angled stakes, mine beams, planted with brutal precision to tear open landing craft and the men inside them. Utah Beach is quieter than expected. Not calm, just restrained. Shellfire cracks inland. Machine guns probe the surf. Smoke drifts low, clinging to the shoreline like fog that refuses to lift. At the waterline, U.S. Army engineers move forward before most infantry. They carry wires, charges, and a weapon many officers did not want here at all. Unofficial, ungainly, built for one purpose: to break open beaches faster than doctrine allowed. It had been criticized in training, restricted in deployment, labeled unsafe. Some called it reckless improvisation. Now it stands aimed at steel and explosives buried in wet sand. The clock is already running. The tide will return. The landing lanes must be opened, or the invasion will choke on its own shoreline. In a matter of minutes, an argument that lasted months is about to end. And to understand why this moment mattered, we have to step back, before Normandy, before the beaches, to a war still learning how deadly a defended coastline could be. The Allies did not arrive at Utah Beach unprepared. They arrived burdened with memory. 2 years earlier, on August 19, 1942, the raid on Dieppe had carved a lesson into Allied planning doctrine with irreversible clarity. British and Canadian forces had attempted a direct assault on a fortified port. The result was catastrophic. Concrete, wire, and interlocking fire had stopped armor cold. Infantry were pinned on open shingle. Engineers were cut down before they could work. More than half the landing force became casualties in a matter of hours. Dieppe proved something that no staff paper could soften. A defended coastline favored the defender absolutely, unless the attacker could remove obstacles faster than bullets could stop them. From that moment forward, amphibious warfare became an engineering problem as much as an infantry one. By 1943, as planning for Operation Overlord accelerated, Allied analysts dissected hundreds of aerial photographs of the Norman coast. What they saw was methodical brutality. Under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's direction, the Atlantic Wall was no symbolic line. It was a layered system. Beach obstacles were placed according to tide charts. Mines were wired to detonate landing craft hulls. Steel hedgehogs were angled to rip open steel ramps. Wooden stakes, Rommelspargel, were capped with teller mines to destroy vehicles before they ever reached dry sand. Utah Beach, positioned on the eastern flank of the Cotentin Peninsula, appeared less heavily fortified than Omaha to the east. But that impression was deceptive. Utah's danger was not firepower alone, it was geometry. Wide tidal flats meant landing craft could be forced to disembark hundreds of yards from dry land. The gradual slope provided no cover. Obstacles were positioned in depth, not clusters. Fail to clear even one lane, and vehicles would back up into the surf. The tide would do the rest. The Allies knew this, and so assault doctrine adapted. Specialist engineer units were embedded directly into the first assault waves. Naval Combat Demolition Units, NCDUs, were trained for underwater obstacle clearance. U.S. Army engineers were tasked with blasting open exits through dunes, seawalls, and mine belts. All of it depended on time. According to Overlord planning estimates, assault troops had a window of roughly 90 minutes between low tide exposure and the water returning over the obstacles. Miss that window, and even success inland would be strangled at the beach. To solve this problem, Allied planners leaned heavily on prepackaged explosive charges. Bangalores, satchel charges, pole charges. Everything had a manual. Everything had a drill. What doctrine resisted was improvisation. Weapons that fell outside established tables of organization were treated with suspicion. Devices without long safety histories were seen as liabilities. Commanders were held accountable for losses caused not only by enemy action, but by equipment failure. This culture mattered, because in the months before D-Day, certain engineer officers began experimenting with ways to clear multiple beach obstacles at once. Methods that did not require men to crawl forward under fire, placing charges by hand. One of these ideas involved using rocket propulsion to deliver explosives directly into obstacle fields. In tests, it worked quickly, too quickly for some observers. Misfires were dramatic. Safety margins were thin, and there was no formal doctrine to govern its use. In training reports, the concerns repeated. Unpredictable trajectory, danger to friendly troops, limited testing time. The weapon was not officially banned, but it was restricted. Authorization was selective. Deployment was discouraged. Many units never saw it at all. Yet the obstacles at Utah Beach did not care about doctrine. Steel and mines would stop landing craft regardless of committee approval. As June 1944 approached, a handful of engineer teams prepared quietly, carrying equipment others considered unnecessary or worse. And when the invasion finally came, the difference between theory and sand was measured in minutes. Those minutes would decide whether Utah Beach stayed open or collapsed under its own unanswered defenses. The weapon at the center of the controversy did not come from a laboratory or an armory. It came from frustration. By late 1943, American engineer units training in Britain had accumulated thousands of demolition experts who understood the problem intimately. Clearing beach obstacles by hand meant exposure. Exposure meant casualties. Casualties meant stalled landings. The logic was brutally simple. Among these engineers were officers and senior non-commissioned specialists with combat experience in North Africa and the Mediterranean. They had watched assaults slow under fire as men struggled to place charges on obstacles that should never have required individual attention. Every obstacle cleared one at a time meant another minute lost, another lane blocked, another craft drifting. The idea of delivering concentrated explosive force at a distance was not new. The British had experimented with line charges and rocket-assisted demolition for breaching minefields. What was different in the American approach was scale and portability. The device that would later be labeled a bazooka launcher for beach obstacles was not a true bazooka in infantry terms. It was a crude, man-portable rocket launcher adapted to fire a heavy demolition charge, often 15 to 25 pounds of explosive attached to a stabilizing frame. Its official designations varied by unit. Some referred to it as a rocket-propelled obstacle charge. Others simply called it the launcher. Its purpose was narrow and dangerous. Strike a cluster of obstacles far enough downrange that engineers could remain partially covered. In testing on British beaches, the launcher succeeded in blasting wide gaps through lines of stakes and hedgehogs. But the margin for error was slim. Rockets occasionally veered. Detonations threw debris unpredictably. Observers watched steel beams cartwheel through surf and sand. To cautious commanders, this was unacceptable. Senior officers responsible for the first waves were already balancing risk against inevitability. Infantry losses were anticipated. Engineer losses were expected. What was not acceptable, in their view, was an uncontrolled weapon adding chaos to a precisely timed landing. Official evaluations reflected this tension. The launcher was not standardized. It had no formal training manual. Replacement parts were improvised. Safety distances were estimates, not calculations. As a result, permission to deploy the launcher was uneven. Some units were authorized to carry it as a secondary option. Others were told to rely on manual charges. In more than one case, recommendations came down advising against its use in the assault phase entirely. Yet no one could dismiss its potential outright. At Utah Beach, the assault plan depended on rapid vehicle movement off the sand. Unlike Omaha, which backed onto bluffs, Utah's exits led through flooded lowlands. Causeways had been identified as critical choke points. If lanes from the waterline were not cleared quickly and cleanly, armor would bottleneck under fire. This made Utah uniquely sensitive to delays. Engineers assigned to the 4th Infantry Division understood the stakes well before June. Many of them practiced with the launcher anyway, despite its unofficial status. Familiarity mattered. If the moment came when conventional methods failed, hesitation would cost lives. German expectations further shaped the equation. Defenders believed beach obstacles would do most of their killing indirectly, by forcing men to slow, cluster, and expose themselves. Machine guns could then finish the work. If obstacles vanished too quickly, the entire defensive rhythm would collapse. This was the logic behind Rommel's obsession with coastal barriers. On the Allied side, the question was simple but unresolved. Should an unapproved, hazardous device be used in the most important amphibious landing in history? There was no final answer before June 6th. Only contingency. When the invasion fleet crossed the channel, the launcher went with it. Not in every boat, not in every sector, but close enough to the front that its presence would matter if the landings went wrong. As dawn approached Normandy, engineers did not know whether they would be allowed to use it. They only knew that the obstacles ahead were real, the tide was moving, and hesitation would not survive contact with the beach. That uncertainty between regulation and necessity followed them all the way toward the sand, and it would define the moment when theory finally collided with fire. The human angle. In the assault waves at Utah Beach, the engineers were lighter than infantry, but carried heavier responsibility. They moved with wire cutters, detonators, reels of cord, and bags of explosive compounds slung low against their bodies. Many were trained electricians, construction workers, miners in civilian life. The war had turned those skills into instruments of survival. Unlike riflemen, engineers did not advance toward the enemy. They advanced toward objects: steel beams, timber stakes, metal teeth driven into sand and wired with mines. Obstacles that would not fire back, but would kill just as efficiently. The launcher represented something simple to them: distance. Distance meant survival. Each foot of separation between man and obstacle reduced exposure to shrapnel, to machine gun enfilade, to premature blast. Engineers trusted physics more than cover, because cover on the beach barely existed. They also understood consequences. A misfired rocket could cripple a team as effectively as German fire. That knowledge did not disappear in a moment. It followed them into the surf. What kept them moving was not thrill or optimism. It was experience. They had seen what stalled landings looked like. They knew the beach would not wait. For many, this device was not innovation. It was necessity reluctantly wrapped in risk. The tactical angle. Utah Beach did not demand heroics. It demanded speed. The German obstacle belts were laid in rows parallel to the shoreline, each tied to water depth. At low tide, the first belts were exposed. At mid-tide, hidden. At high tide, lethal to landing craft only moments before disembarkation. Clearing doctrine emphasized lanes, narrow corridors marked with flags, wide enough for tanks and trucks to pass through without triggering mines or collisions. Every lane had to align from surf zone to dune exit. Manual demolition could clear a single obstacle at a time. The launcher offered something different. One blast could collapse or destabilize several obstacles in sequence, particularly those wired together. From a tactical standpoint, this created momentum. A lane opened quickly allowed follow-on units to exploit it before defenders reacted. Time, more than explosive weight, was the currency of the assault. The technological angle. The launcher itself was inelegant. Constructed from steel tubing and basic ignition systems, it fired a rocket carrying a demolition charge tuned for blast, not penetration. Range was limited. Accuracy depended on wind, balance, and operator experience. There were no sights worthy of the name. There was no recoil buffer. Misfires were addressed manually. Yet within its limits, it achieved something conventional charges could not. It delivered force forward without exposing men unnecessarily. Its existence sat uncomfortably between infantry weaponry and engineering equipment. It belonged fully to neither. That ambiguity would define its fate, both before the landings and in the minutes that followed first contact. Those minutes were approaching, and with them came a test no training beach had ever replicated. The leadership angle. For senior commanders, the problem was not whether the launcher worked. It was whether it could be trusted. Amphibious landings are orchestration under fire. Every unit's action ripples outward. A weapon that behaved unpredictably could compromise timing, misdirect troops, or cause friendly casualties in a zone already pushed to its limit. Commanders responsible for first-wave integrity were deeply conservative by necessity. Once boats touched sand, there would be no recalls, no replacements, no second chances to adjust doctrine. That reality favored equipment with known failure modes, even if slower, over devices that promise speed at the cost of control. Several after-action memoranda prior to D-Day reflect this mindset. The launcher was repeatedly described as useful but hazardous, a phrase that effectively placed it outside preferred assault tools. Some landing plans limited its authorization to specific engineers. Others omitted it altogether. Yet leadership also understood something more quietly. D-Day would not go according to plan. No landing ever did. That understanding left room, small but critical, for officers on the beach to make their own judgments when conditions demanded it. The enemy angle. German defenders at Utah Beach were trained to watch the waterline. Obstacle belts were not expected to stop an invasion alone. They were meant to shape it. Force men to slow. Force craft to bunch. Force exposure long enough for machine guns and mortars to do decisive damage. What they did not expect was sudden disappearance. German doctrine assumed obstacles would take time to clear. Even small gaps were expected to appear gradually under fire. What appeared at Utah in certain sectors instead was abrupt disruption. Where obstacles vanished quickly, defensive fires lagged. Weapon crews hesitated, unsure whether mines had been prematurely detonated or lanes deliberately cleared. That hesitation mattered. Defensive planning assumed predictability. The launcher introduced something closer to shock. The moral angle. The launcher raised a question that war has repeated endlessly. When does safety become stagnation? Rejecting it was not cowardice. It was caution born from responsibility. Accepting it was not recklessness. It was acknowledgement that men under fire rarely have the luxury of procedure. The engineers carrying it were not defying orders. They were preparing for exception. War rewards those who recognize when rules no longer apply. It punishes those who pretend they always do. Utah Beach would not judge the launcher by paperwork or approval stamps. It would judge it by what it cleared and how fast. The decision to use it would not come from a briefing room. It would come from the sand, under fire, with the tide moving in. And when that decision was made, the landing would shift from theory into irrevocable action. The hours of preparation were ending. The decisive minutes were about to begin. June 6, 1944. 6:30 hours. The first assault waves at Utah Beach did not land exactly where planned. Strong currents pushed many craft nearly a mile south of their intended sectors. It was a navigational error that could have unraveled the assault. Instead, it simplified it. The shoreline here was defended, but less densely than anticipated. Fire was sporadic. Smoke hung low. German resistance existed, but it lacked the cohesion expected from pre-invasion intelligence. For the engineers, that meant only one thing mattered: speed. As landing craft ramps dropped, men poured into waist-deep water. Obstacles loomed immediately. Angled wooden stakes laced with mines, steel hedgehogs partially buried in wet sand. Some are already marked by naval gunfire damage. Most were intact. Engineers moved ahead of infantry, exactly as doctrine demanded. They crawled. They waited. Some began placing manual charges the familiar way, wiring, setting timers, backing away under fire. But in several lanes, time ran thinner. The tide had exposed obstacle belts perfectly, but it would not hold. The water was already creeping back in. In one sector, a team leader made the decision that training had postponed and command had avoided. The launcher was brought forward. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a tube placed against sand, angled roughly toward the densest cluster of obstacles blocking a designated vehicle lane. The operator braced. The charge was armed. Nearby engineers flattened themselves instinctively, trusting distance more than cover. The rocket fired. Its flight was short and imperfect, yawing slightly in the air, trailing smoke across the gray beach. It struck low, near the base of a hedgehog line wired thick with mines. The explosion was not clean. It was violent. Steel beams lifted, twisted, and collapsed inward. Mines detonated in succession, not all at once, but enough to tear the integrity out of the obstacle line. Water geysered upward. Shrapnel cut through sand and air. When debris settled, the lane was no longer closed. Engineers surged forward immediately, doing what the launcher could not: cutting wires, neutralizing surviving charges, marking safe passage with flags driven hard into sand. Another launcher followed, then another. Not every shot behaved. One veered wide and detonated among partially submerged stakes. Another embedded harmlessly before detonating late. Each moment carried risk, but the results accumulated faster than failures. By mid-morning, in several Utah beach sectors, lanes were opening at a pace planners had hoped for, but never guaranteed. Vehicles followed infantry sooner than expected. Tanks came ashore with fewer delays. Traffic moved inland before German artillery could re-register targets. The launcher had done exactly what its advocates claimed, and exactly what its critics feared. It introduced danger, and it erased obstacles faster than anything else available. The battlefield was already adjusting. The decisive question now was whether this speed would convert into something larger, or whether the beach would still stall before the window closed. That answer would come soon, measured not in hours, but in minutes. By 6:52 hours, the rhythm of the landing had changed. What planners had feared most, a congestion of men and machines trapped between tide and fire, did not materialize at Utah Beach. Instead, lanes began to appear with surprising clarity. White tape and signal flags marked passages through what minutes earlier had been a field of steel and explosives. The launcher was not responsible for everything. Naval gunfire had shattered some obstacles. Manual charges still did most of the delicate work. But in crucial moments where obstacle density threatened to slow the assault beyond recovery, rocket-fired demolition broke the pattern. One engineer report later noted that entire clusters of obstacles had been rendered structurally meaningless by a single detonation. Stakes were snapped or driven at angles that removed their threat. Hedgehogs, designed to resist vehicles, were knocked flat or pulled apart by sympathetic mine blasts. The effect compounded. Every cleared lane allowed bulldozers and tanks to move forward. Those vehicles, in turn, widened paths and crushed weakened obstacles farther inland. Momentum built not from firepower, but from motion. German defenders struggled to respond effectively. Defensive fire had been planned around intact belts. When vehicles appeared sooner than expected, firing solutions lagged. Some positions were bypassed rather than assaulted. Others surrendered later, isolated and cut off from the beach itself. At approximately 7:05 hours, engineers assessed several primary exit lanes as operational. The time between first launcher deployment and usable inland passage was just over 20 minutes. 22 minutes, according to post-landing estimates. That span was decisive. It meant armored units from the 4th Infantry Division reached causeways earlier than anticipated. It meant supply vehicles were not trapped at the shoreline. It meant the beachhead transition from a vulnerable line into a functioning logistics node before German countermeasures could fully engage. Critically, it meant casualties remained lower than predicted. Utah Beach would record fewer than 200 Allied casualties on D-Day, a stark contrast to Omaha to the east. No single factor explains that outcome. Luck played its part. Navigation errors reduced resistance density. Leadership decisions mattered, but so did clearance speed. The launcher did not win Utah Beach. It removed one of the invasion's most dangerous delays. By the time higher command fully grasped what had occurred, the landing phase was already passing into consolidation. Reports mentioned rapid obstacle clearance without dwelling on methods. In war, success often erases debate rather than settles it. Engineers moved on to their next tasks. Infantry pushed inland. The tide returned, washing over shattered remnants of Rommel's defenses. The beach that had been mined, wired, and planned to stop an army in the surf was now behind them. The argument that had followed the launcher across months of training ended not with approval, but with silence. Because at Utah Beach, the time it bought could no longer be argued with. And as the invasion expanded beyond the sand, the consequences of those 22 minutes would become clearer in ways no after-action report could fully capture. By the afternoon of June 6th, Utah Beach no longer resembled a place of crisis. Landing craft continued to arrive in steady intervals. Vehicles rolled ashore in organized columns instead of desperate clusters. Engineers shifted from clearing lanes to expanding them, marking minefields and repairing damage caused by their own explosives. This outward calm concealed how narrow the margin had been. Post-invasion analyses drew immediate contrast between Utah and Omaha beaches. Omaha's landing zones, burdened by intact obstacles, stronger fire, and delayed breakthroughs, became synonymous with chaos and loss. Utah, by contrast, was described in operational summaries as progressing rapidly and ahead of schedule. The casualty figures told part of the story. Utah Beach recorded roughly 197 American casualties on D-Day, including killed, wounded, and missing. Omaha would suffer more than 10 times that number. No planner would claim the beaches had been equal, but the speed of obstacle clearance was repeatedly cited as a force multiplier. Engineering after-action reports highlighted lane availability as the primary factor in maintaining momentum. In sections where clearance was delayed, even briefly, congestion formed immediately. In sections where demolition occurred swiftly, follow-on waves flowed inland with minimal disruption. Several reports made indirect reference to rocket-assisted demolition without naming it explicitly. The language was cautious. Multiple obstacles neutralized simultaneously. Remote detonation of obstacle clusters. The emphasis remained on results, not methods. This was not accidental. In the weeks following D-Day, institutional attention shifted inland. Normandy itself became a vast engineering challenge. Bridges, roads, hedgerows, waterways. Beach obstacle clearance, once critical, quickly receded into background detail. For the engineers who had operated the launcher, recognition was modest or non-existent. Their units were praised collectively. Individual innovations disappeared into the larger narrative of success. Yet privately, assessments circulated. One U.S. Army engineer officer noted that remote explosive delivery had materially reduced exposure time. Another observed that the fear surrounding the launcher before D-Day proved out of proportion to actual hazard under combat conditions. The phrasing mattered. Under combat conditions, acknowledge something training never could. War reorders risk. Dangers unacceptable in rehearsal become tolerable when weighed against the alternative. The launcher forced that recalculation in real time. Not all implications were comfortable. Debris injuries did occur. One engineer was reportedly wounded by flying metal during an early deployment. Misfires were documented. The device required experienced handling and situational judgment. But none of those incidents outweighed the strategic outcome. Utah Beach functioned. And because it functioned, the American lodgment in Normandy stabilized faster than planners had dared hope. The impact of those early minutes now extended beyond the shoreline, into logistics, maneuver, and the collapse of German defensive coherence in the Cotentin. The weapon had done its work quietly. Its influence was already being absorbed into doctrine without ceremony. What remained was the question of what would happen next to the launcher itself and to the mindset that had nearly left it behind. Continue to Section 2 of Aftermath. Aftermath, Section 2. In the months that followed the Normandy landings, the launcher entered an ambiguous limbo. It was neither formally celebrated nor explicitly condemned. Like many battlefield adaptations, it existed in the space between doctrine and memory, acknowledged but not emphasized. As the Allied advance pushed through Normandy and toward Paris, engineering priorities shifted rapidly. River crossings replaced beach obstacles. Urban rubble replaced coastal mines. The problems that demanded attention were new, and the launcher's specific utility diminished with distance from the sea. Yet the lessons it embodied did not disappear. Technical evaluations conducted later in 1944 revisited the concept of remote explosive delivery. Line charges, rocket-assisted breaching devices, and specialized armored engineering vehicles received renewed interest. American and British engineers compared notes, often rediscovering ideas that had proven themselves under fire before being fully accepted on paper. The launcher itself was not widely standardized. It lacked the refinement and safety margins necessary for broad issue. But its underlying principle, reducing human exposure by extending blast distance, found its way into later designs. Leadership perspectives evolved as well. Officers who had been skeptical before D-Day rarely reversed their positions publicly. Instead, their reports framed outcomes as validation of engineering initiative under combat conditions. Innovation was praised indirectly, stripped of its contentious edges. Risks were reframed as calculated. Improvisation was reframed as adaptation. This reframing mattered. Military institutions do not like admitting near mistakes. They prefer to convert them into quiet inevitabilities. For the men who had built, carried, and fired the launcher, the war offered little time for reflection. They continued forward with their units through brutal fighting in the hedgerows, where engineering ingenuity would again prove essential in ways far removed from beaches. Some never returned home. Others did, carrying knowledge rather than medals. In post-war histories, Utah Beach became the easy landing. A footnote compared to Omaha's bloodshed. That label obscured the truth. Utah was not easy. It was narrowly successful. Had lanes remained blocked for even an hour longer, German artillery could have concentrated fire. Vehicles would have stacked in the surf. Casualties would have multiplied. The psychological imprint of Normandy might have shifted entirely. Those outcomes were avoided not by grand strategy alone, but by small, contested decisions made by men trusted to act when planning ended. The launcher's story faded because it did not fit heroic narrative structures. It did not symbolize sacrifice or command genius. It represented friction between caution and urgency, safety and necessity. Yet wars are shaped by friction far more often than by clarity. At Utah Beach, a weapon once considered too dangerous was used precisely because the alternative was worse. The obstacle belts that Rommel trusted were removed more quickly than expected. The beachhead took shape faster than German planners believed possible. And in that compression of time, the invasion gained something invaluable: room to breathe. What remains, decades later, is not the device itself, but the lesson it carried. And that lesson reaches beyond Normandy. History remembers Normandy in images of cliffs, flags, and endless rows of crosses. It remembers courage under fire and sacrifice on an immense scale. What it rarely pauses on are the minutes that barely leave a trace. Utah Beach was shaped by minutes. Minutes in which obstacles were cleared before water reclaimed them. Minutes in which vehicles moved inland before defenders could adjust. Minutes in which risk was accepted because delay promised something worse. The launcher did not symbolize technological triumph. It symbolized judgment, a recognition that no doctrine survives first contact intact, and that fidelity to rules must sometimes yield to fidelity to outcome. Its existence reminds us that wars are not won solely by the weapons that appear in museums or memorials. They are won by tools that work quietly, once in the right place under the right conditions, and are then discarded without ceremony. The men who used it were not trying to make history. They were trying to stay alive long enough to finish a job. At Utah Beach, they did. The beach cleared. The landings flowed inland. The foothold in France held. And when larger narratives took shape in the weeks that followed, the moments that made them possible slipped beneath the surface, washed away by the returning tide. They remain invisible to most. But without them, nothing else could have followed.